It's time for the moment you've been waiting for. Yes, it is the Batmobile. Ladies and gentlemen, what I will go on record and say is probably the most in-demand product, not just figure, not just vehicle, not even collectible as far as statues, comic books, little trinkets and accessory packs, whatever. The most in-demand product that McFarlane Toys probably has ever produced in their history since owning or at least partnering with DC on the license in 2018. And that is quite frankly a bold statement, and who can really blame the demand for this thing, because this is the 89, well, for the most part, the 89 Keaton Batmobile from the Flash movie. So it's not necessarily one-to-one in terms of accuracy for the original Tim Burton 1989 film, but at least it's kind of scratching those itches for an awful lot of people. And because of that, at the very, very competitive price point of $60, yeah, you can definitely see that this guy is going to be in very hefty demand, so much so that McFarlane Toys themselves is probably trying to keep up with orders, and as such, this guy is virtually sold out everywhere. But is all of that very hectic demand for the collectible vehicle really truly worth it? Well, in order to find out, you gotta open up the box, which comes in this very hefty cardboard box, and as soon as you open it, you're gonna be treated with an awful lot more excessive cardboard, including this piece right here that honestly, as soon as I saw it, I thought to myself, this would make for a very cool arts and crafts project. I mean, look at the little teeth there, could definitely be used for a mount. So parents out there with kids, utilize that cardboard. Don't take that cardboard for granted. Use it. Then you get to the vehicle itself, kind of bagged up here in this plastic bag, and also the separated wings. So that kind of go ahead and tells you that there's going to be just a little bit of assembly required. And that's honestly the only real thing that you need to assemble together with the rest of the body, but it's so straightforward that McFarlane themselves didn't even bother to throw in instructions. And it's pretty self-explanatory. You see the L, the R for the left and right wings, the corresponding tabs, and all you gotta do is just fit the tabs into place. Of course, I still highly recommend that you double check your wings, because I have seen some people over on Reddit report that some folks have been receiving either 2 left wings or 2 right wings, and that could be very detrimental. So double check your wings, and if there's an issue, get in touch with the retailer that you bought it from or McFarlane Toys store themselves. But once you get all of that rolling, here it is, the 89, or rather Flash movie, Keaton Batmobile, and it's deceptively huge, so much so that obviously you can tell could not fit into the light box that I typically, or at least most recently typically, use for my reviews to orchestrate really accurate lighting and make sure that everything's proportioned well. This is not going to be the case for such a hefty vehicle, and as such, we had to resort to the original setup amongst the desk. But it, like I mentioned before, it's deceptively huge to where, coming from inside the box, I thought to myself, well, it feels pretty light. I feel like the bulkiness of the box is going to be that cardboard that I was mentioning. But once I set it up on the table here, yep, it's pretty beefy and pretty hefty. It almost kind of reminds me of that of a small dog. I know, very strange comparison, but you know how sometimes you see a small dog, think to yourself, oh, it's a pretty small little puppy, and then as soon as you pick up the bastard, you know, it feels pretty hefty in hand, and to try to maneuver it with your hands, despite not being all that weighty, you still have an awful lot of dimensions and an awful lot of proportions that you have to handle very carefully, because this is meant to be what is pretty much a 1/10 scale Batmobile to coincide with the rest of the 7-inch McFarlane figures, most notably the Keaton 89 Batman that just recently came out. And as you can tell, it comes in this glossy black finish, which to me didn't personally bother me all too much, but I completely understand for some folks that did in fact grow up with the Keaton movies, they might kind of take a little bit of umbrage with the fact that this is much more of a glossier finish with the plastic that McFarlane decided to utilize on the vehicle, and because of that, it may not be one-to-one accurate, but at the very least, you can take into consideration that this is meant to be the Flash movie Batmobile as opposed to the 89 one that did in fact have a little bit more of a matted finish. Personally, I feel like when I go back and watch those films, it doesn't necessarily look all that glossy, but not 100% matted either. I like to liken it to more of a satin finish, kind of like a cross in the middle kind of material that is a little reflective like glossy, but also still a little bit matted to not be super reflective. And thus far, the only company that has been able to nail that material finish on the Batmobile is, of course, going to be Hot Toys. And that's a whole nother ballpark, a whole nother league, as a matter of fact. So if you're not willing to spend that kind of money, $60 is essentially what's going to get you here in the McFarlane Toys fashion. And for the most part, I really can't complain too much. And like I said, I don't really have that much of an affinity, that much of nostalgia glasses for the original matted look of the 89 Batmobile. But there was one other objective issue that I did have as I kind of played around with the vehicle and started moving it about and started rolling it on this flat surface, which it does pretty decently amongst the tires, but it was playing with it in that manner that I then noticed my key issue that's going to be with this glossy finish, and that is that it's of course going to be a major dust and fingerprint magnet. Upon owning this thing and taking it out of the box for just a couple of days, I noted that there's several prints throughout the chassis of the car, as well as fingerprints, dust, several different little things that I constantly have to take a microfiber cloth and just wipe the whole thing down to at least bring it back to snuff of how it was when I pulled it out of the box. Otherwise, it's already gonna have this kind of used up look to it, and that will probably be my only major issue with the actual finish of the vehicle. Not so much in the quality, because again, for the value that you're getting in $60, the plastic and the actual material utilized here is not necessarily my main problem. It is going to be my OCD getting triggered by the fact that so much dust is kicking up on the body itself already. And you could argue that that finish also reflects, pun intended, on the quality of plastic, which admittingly, I'm not going to say it could be better because it does match the value of $60, but at the same time, it's not necessarily all that different to that of some of the other vehicles that McFarlane has produced for either cheaper prices or at least almost equivalent prices. Kind of reminds me a little bit of that Batmobile. I can't remember what it was. Oh, the Batmobeast. The Batmobeast, the quality of plastic that was used on that shell that you can remove in case you didn't really want it. It kind of reminds me of that form of plastic for the majority of the vehicle here at the front. But once we get to the back, it does kind of develop a little bit of an extra girth to make it feel a bit more solid and sound and very firm, and kind of plaster it down to make sure that it doesn't feel too light and doesn't feel too terribly cheap, and you get your money's worth. The majority of the weight, however, falls on the shoulders, or rather the treads of the tires. It's actually the tires that feel a bit more premium, especially because they are in fact rubberized, but they got good treads and sculpting within the actual rivets of the rims, the emblems here in the middle, as well as, like I said, the actual quality of rubber they utilized for the tires themselves that are very flat lined. They're very aligned with each other amongst the axles, and they actually roll around on the surface pretty nicely. But it's mainly there where you draw an awful lot of the weight that gives the overall vehicle that weighty feel that feels pretty good in hand. If it wasn't for those tires, I would say, yeah, the plastic could have been filled in a little bit extra, especially right here in the middle parts when you see an awful lot of the illusionary details, such as the piping and the gears and all this metallic stuff that's happening alongside the side here, which is a fine touch, but it just begs for some extra work to be put into it. But as they stand, an awful lot of these details, despite feeling, like I said, a little underpainted, a little under-detailed, under-sculpted, still are accurate to an awful lot of the stills that we've seen of the Batmobile in the Flash movie thus far, especially this area right here. This is actually one of my favorite areas of the whole vehicle, with the little texturized grip pattern happening inside of this little circular part, as well as the vents happening alongside the side here in front of the rear tires, the panels and the little vents happening alongside the body here at the top and on the sides. And then, of course, the very distinguishable traits of the Keaton Batmobile, which of course are going to be the headlights here on the front, the turbine engine that unfortunately does not spin, but it's still there, very solidly built and sculpted, especially with the little tabs right here that are meant to rotate. But of course, that's left to your preference as to whether or not you want to modify that there in the future. And then, of course, we then revert to the back, where arguably I would say my favorite part of the entire vehicle, at least with the McFarlane interpretation here, has to be this back part. This overall ensemble with the, of course, the Spitfire piece right here in the middle that unfortunately doesn't have anything actually happening on the inside. There's no like paint work to make it look like it's burnt or make it look like fire is about to ignite, but at least it's sculpted very well and has this nice airbrushed kind of decal happening alongside the gray, the two little exhausts right here on the sides, as of course the tail lights here on the back, and then of course the wings and the overall plastic structure of this whole entire part right here that has always been one of my favorite aspects of the Batmobile, Keaton's Batmobile, not only from this version of the McFarlane vehicle, but also the original Keaton design back in '89. I always appreciated the very Corvette style, that old school 1950s vehicle, but then they just kind of decked it out, and that was ultimately inspiration, and I've always kind of favored that design when it comes to vehicles. So to see it happen in Batmobile fashion and then McFarlane taking it and kind of inspiring it here, and doesn't look like it's very compromised, is a very fine touch. The only thing I will have to nitpick, however, would have to be these wings, because upon assembly, there was just something about the wings that just looked a little too low to me. I feel like looking back at some of the production stills from the '89 movie and even some of those quick shots of the Batmobile in the Flash trailer, these wings are meant to be just a little higher. I don't know if it's just me, but I feel like these wings are just a little low when it comes to the way that they were assembled and sculpted and put onto the vehicle itself. I kind of wish that they were a little bit higher, but that's just one of the minor little inaccuracies amongst this vehicle. Let's tackle the biggest one of them all, which of course is going to be the elephant in the room that several folks were commenting on, not only when this guy was unveiled, but then released and kind of being found out in the wild, and that's gonna be that goddamn canopy. Yeah, let's get it out of the way. It is in fact gray. It is gray. It does stand out like a bit of a sore thumb, but like some other folks have in fact mentioned, it looks a little better in person. I still prefer that it was black. It was an overall black piece, and it just begs for it to be customized that way. But at least it's a little easier on the eyes when seeing it in person. It's kind of more of a muted gray, and it does look like a separated piece, but still naturally flushes with the rest of the body. And it is in fact the only functionable part about the vehicle that you can kind of interact with, because the canopy itself does in fact open via a button that you can press here at the center part of the top of the chassis, and when you do it, press it and it pops open the canopy. Now, one thing to note is that when you open up the canopy and slide it forwards right there, which admittedly could slide a little better, I do from time to time it feels a little finicky and you kind of have to grab it and pull it yourself, because otherwise it's going to feel like it's just kind of futzing around there, and it does feel just a teensy-winsy bit on the cheap side, but just a minor nitpick on my part. Once you get the canopy open, you will then actually find the collectible trading card inside. This is actually where they decided to keep the trading card that McFarlane always throws in with their vehicles and action figures. So do be careful to not miss out on the trading card, because it is in there, and it does actually boast a very strange description on the back. The data file description is worded a little weird. It says, "The Batmobile, long forgotten and hidden away in the dark recesses of the Batcave. The Batmobile remains..." Why did they repeat the Batmobile twice? I don't know what they did. I feel like that's a grammatical... Did anybody else find that kind of awkward when they read theirs? I don't know. That's just me. Anyways, once you get the trading card out of the way upon opening the canopy, you are then greeted with several different little details painted on the dashboard as well as the seat that are actually pretty well done for a McFarlane vehicle. Of course, many other customizers out there are probably going to go to town on that thing to make sure to add their own little details of blue, green, red, little dials, things here and there, because it is a little, much like the little gray parts on the side of the vehicle here, they are a little underpainted. It's just this generic kind of chrome gray, but at least, like I said, for the value that you're getting, I can't complain terribly too much because if they were to have put in some extra work hours into doing that amongst the conception phase of this thing, it probably would have cost somewhere closer to about 100. So to remain competitive, that's probably one of the areas that they had to cut back on. I feel like they could have done it, but again, to remain competitive, they had to, and to make sure that this thing got released and got into people's hands as soon as possible before the release of the film itself, that's probably one of the cutbacks that they had to make. Nevertheless, like I said, the seat is placed in there. You got the dashboard, you got the wheel that unfortunately does not rotate. That's probably the only area that they could have at least added a nice little fine detail of making sure that you can actually move the wheel from left to right, but unfortunately it is stagnated there. But you really can't complain with the overall real estate space you're getting inside of the driver's seat. So much so that McFarlane themselves advertise that this is meant to work with the majority, not all, but most 7-inch figures. And that is of course going to include the 89 Keaton Batman that I most recently reviewed from the Flash movie. And there he is. He's ready to hop a ride and make sure to patrol Gotham with this sweet set of wheels. Now, this is where things do get a little contested, because even though this is obviously going to be the Batman that you're going to want to fit into the Batmobile, this is where I came into a couple of issues trying to fit this guy in there, because his legs barely, as noted in my original review, barely lift up due to the way that the diaper piece kind of encroaches everything and kind of restricts the mobility a little bit, that I'm actually a little scared that that crotch piece is going to get warped should you have the Batman figure in this pose, in the seated pose, to get him in there for too long. And furthermore, in order to optimize the way that you fit the figure in there in the best way possible, you kind of have to fold the feet downwards to kind of get this kind of pointed look for the feet. And then fitting him in there, I don't want to say it's a total nightmare, but it does require more work than I think it needed to have. And so much so that for a little while, I thought to myself that I was doing it wrong. And I took to Reddit and asked folks, are there any kind of like hacks or extra techniques to get this guy to fit in there as comfortably as possible? Because when I was originally putting him in there, he was actually not sitting all the way through, and his ears were actually coming into contact of this top part of the plastic here and the canopy when closing it. So he wasn't fitting all the way in there. And I'm going to try to demonstrate this as best as possible. But basically, one Reddit user, I'll post their reply right here to kind of showcase them and credit their work, because thank God that they told me about this. But they told me that under the dashboard, there's actually two slots, two very finely cut out slots that are specifically made to fit his 2 feet and part of his boots in there, so that he can slide in a little bit more comfortably and give you a little bit more wiggle room to get the head a little lower and make sure that it doesn't cut off his ears or risk warping them in any kind of way. Now, this whole overall method is not necessarily the most polished. It doesn't do the most perfect job. I still feel like they could have refined a little bit of the proportioning happening inside of the space of the cockpit, but it is a little better than originally conceived. So let me go ahead and try to do it here. And of course, one of those other little aspects to take into account is making sure that you don't terribly wrinkle the cape. So what I like to do is to kind of go into my draping mode, like you're kind of like folding it into the arms, but then kind of coil it into the inside of his crotch and just kind of fold it down, while at the same time making it look as natural as possible. So there it is inside, but he's not in all the way, because again, you kind of have to play around and make sure that those feet are plugged into those holes as much as possible, because sometimes you are going to have to reach in and finger your way until you feel the holes.
That's what she said.
And so yeah, like as you can see, it kind of works sometimes and it kind of doesn't. You just have to keep playing with it and playing with it until you eventually, because those holes are so deep in there. I'm trying my best not to do this so often. But anyways, yeah, fitting the feet into, see, look, I feel like I got one but not the other. So if you don't nail it 100%, God, there go with the innuendo again. But you can see the ears are still a little too high. That in order to get it fit in there, you either have to resort to bending the head at an angle like this so you can fit the ears underneath this little groove at the top part of this plastic right here so that the canopy can close all the way, or just keep futzing with the figure until you can feel that the feet went into those two holes. Because right now I'm just not feeling it, and it's very tough to demonstrate on camera because, like I said, those holes are so deep in there that you can't even see it with your own eye. You can only really feel it. And this is definitely one area that I think McFarlane could have made a little better as far as user friendliness, as far as engagement, because let's be honest, this is mostly going to be for collectors such as myself, not necessarily kids. But should there be a parent who's not a major Batman fan but their kids are, and they want to take this home upon rarely finding it up on the shelf, and so when they try to fit their figures, they're going to end up with probably a handful of broken figures because they're trying to fit it in there. They're either going to break their figure, they're going to break the Batman head, or they're going to break the canopy doing something here. So even though some of us are very careful with our vehicles and our collectibles, there's going to be some other people out there that are either kids that don't know how to work the thing, or adults that act like kids and don't necessarily have the greatest amount of patience, and thus are going to end up with an awful lot of things. So right now, like I said, trying to demonstrate it on camera, now it's not working. It almost ends up being like a 50-50 chance of it naturally working to my advantage. And for the most part, I'm not going to really want to pose Keaton Batman in that manner inside of the cockpit that much, because like I said before, even if I do manage to get him situated all the way inside, it's going to come at the cost of potentially rippling and wearing and tearing the crotch piece right here because of the way that it's flexing it to get the legs to stand up all the way up like that. So I feel like the most advantageous pose that I can possibly put him in is going to be like this, standing right next to his sweet ride, kind of like how he did in the movie. And I would say that in and of itself is really why you get the vehicle, why you get the Batmobile, so that he can look cool next to the Keaton Batman while at the same time completing the ensemble, completing the image, and at the same time remaining, like I mentioned before, competitive with other companies. At $60, you truly do get what you paid for, and I'm not really saying that in the most negative light. You're getting a very solid vehicle that feels weighty because of the tires, the little details that, for the most part, McFarlane was able to get right. But much like with several other vehicles and even some figures from McFarlane Toys themselves, this is one that just begs for custom work. Most importantly, to get this goddamn canopy color corrected, so to speak, to make sure that it's completely black. And I'm personally so tempted to do it myself that I went ahead and bought a second one. Yes, I ended up getting a second one from Macy's because I wasn't really sure if I was gonna get one through store pickup or another one delivered to the house, and I ended up with two. And before I could really bring myself to return one, I thought to myself, if that canopy does in fact end up being gray, I might make it a personal project of mine to get the canopy painted black, to get the whole thing matted finish, to get those LED lights. And my brain started to work, and I thought to myself, you know what? It would make for some interesting content on the channel. So stay tuned, guys, in the event that I do in fact decide to retro mod an entire McFarlane Toys Batmobile. So stay tuned for that. In the meantime, as it is, I would say that this is definitely one of the more showcasier vehicles that McFarlane Toys has produced thus far. And even though it does have its shortcomings, such as the gray canopy, the issues that I did have with fitting one of the Batman figures, most notably the Keaton Batman, into the cockpit, and some areas that could have used an extra layer of work, whether it be paint, decal, sculpting, this is still a worthwhile pickup for, again, the very competitive price of $60, and I will give it an 8 out of 10. Anything teetering over that as far as that quality and that production value, especially if they were to outfit it with LEDs, sound effects, or again, die-cast pieces, then we will start to kind of dip our toes into the territory of hot toys or vintage figures from other companies in the past. Now, if you have been lucky enough to have come across it locally or online and you managed to get your own, let me know in the comment section. Are you guys enjoying the McFarlane Toys Batmobile from the Flash movie? If you haven't owned it yet, are you going to be picking it up with no hesitation, or are you waiting to see if there's going to be a brand new gold label that's going to be retrofitted to look like the original 89 along with the figure? Because that's so far the rumor that's starting to circulate around. And if you haven't already watched it, I did do a review on the McFarlane Toys 89 Keaton Batman figure that is showing up on screen right now, so go and check it out. Otherwise, take care, and as always, stay humble.